Would I recommend? No. Hey party people, let's talk about the 4 books that I read and the 4 TV shows that I watched in March and if I would recommend them with a yes, no, or maybe. If we want to talk about statistics and numbers in total, I have them on my phone. I read 1,445 pages and I watched 1,590 minutes of TV. I feel like I say this all the time about months, but it really does feel like March passed in like the blink of an eye. I feel like we can hop into the books first and then go over to the TV shows, so let's talk about Deep End first. I read Deep End in February at the very end of it, but I don't know why I keep thinking that I read it in March, so I feel like it's kind of a part of like my March wrap up, even though it's not. But since I've already said it, like let's talk about it. Deep End by Ali Hazelwood, I would say maybe. At first I was leaning towards yes, but I do feel like there are equal measures of criticisms and positives that I have in relation to the book that lands it kind of on a... I feel like if you regularly enjoy Ali Hazelwood's work, yes, I would recommend this. However, maybe if this is the first book you're trying to dive into with her work, I don't know if I would recommend this one. I feel like at first I was thinking yes because I did enjoy it. I had a fun time reading it, but okay, let's break it down quickly first without spoiling. For the positives, I enjoy Ali Hazelwood's writing for the most part. I saw somebody note this and I kind of completely forgot about this because it feels like it's been so long since I read The Love Hypothesis. And this is also probably why Love Theoretically landed flat for me, is that the pop culture references. I feel like I'm not going to rehash. You guys know how I feel about those. And that was the same thing in Love Theoretically. So many Twilight references. And that's not like my main critique of that novel, but it was one that every time it appeared, I was like, all right. It was very much like a focal plot point in that book. Like it ended up not just being like kind of like throwaway lines, but I'm getting away from myself. Which is basically all to say that I've come to enjoy her writing style more and more. Yes, because she's lessened on that. But I feel like, but somebody once said this about like a lot of writers who cross over from fan fiction to like originally published works, is that this can both be a negative and a positive sometimes. Sometimes it can work very much to the book's detriment. But they describe this about a lot of authors who cross over from fanfic to originally published works, is that the writing does still have the remnants of fanfiction where it feels kind of like self-indulgent in the way that like fan fiction is like largely like written for itself. There's something very like, you know, that common phrase that's like, oh, like from fan fiction, if you know what I'm talking about. And for Ali Hazelwood, when it comes to kind of the emotional, immersive aspect of it, she's taken over that piece from her fanfiction days that I recognize and enjoy. However, but like I said, this is kind of like a double-edged sword sometimes where I'll note one thing that's kind of positive that makes me think like, oh, this author, like, I think they maybe probably used to write like fan fiction. And there will be another piece that's like, oh yeah, they were used to write like fan fiction and this is like crossing over into their originally published works in not a great way. And I think that comes down to her archetypes. I've made like another video on this, shameless plug, about the ways in which elements of fan fiction and the way like fan fiction is categorized and promoted, let's say on like AO3, is crossing over into originally published works. And particularly, let's say like with things like tropes and like archetypes like Grumpy Sunshine, this can make it so that the characters do not feel like they have distinct personalities. It just feels like this agglomeration of Grumpy Sunshine, one bed trope, things like that. I feel like to Ali Hazelwood's work, the archetype part is where it mostly applies. When it comes to her books, if you've read, I've now read 4 books by her, The Love Hypothesis, Bride, Love Theoretically, and Deep End. I feel like maybe excluding Bride, she really loves the archetype of a woman, kind of quirky. She's a people pleaser. She doesn't know how to really like put herself first more often than not. And then the man is he. And actually, the last point for the female main character, she's usually very oblivious to the fact that the male love interest is like deeply in love with her. So the male main character, he's been desperately in love with her for like years or for a really long time and she's like never been aware of it. She actually usually thinks that he hates her. He's usually grumpy or like standoffish and aloof in a way that like makes her also think that he hates her, and he knows her very well. That's the archetype that you will find across these books. I can't speak to other ones like Love on the Brain or like Checkmate because I haven't read those, but I have also heard similar things from them. I'm not going to make definitive statements on those because I haven't read them and so that feels unfair. But it gets to a point where it's like, this is an enjoyable read because I'm not gonna lie, I like that archetype. I enjoy reading that archetype. I come back to her works in part because when I want to read about a man that honestly has like little to no flaws and understands her deeply, and like, and she doesn't think that anybody like can love her or like love this part of her, and he loves her completely. I eat that right up. However, at the same time, it can make for very bland characters. I enjoyed reading from Scarlett's point of view in Deep End, but I know that this book isn't really gonna sit with me. Like, it was like it was a good read for the most part. I really feel like it definitely had its bright spots for me, and I appreciated that there were certain things that I have read in Natalie Hazelwood's books that haven't really landed for me before. Like, certain things were tempered. There were other elements that felt kind of flimsy in the book, in this, oh, this is only happening for the sake of the plot moving forward. This doesn't really make a lot of sense, like in the context of how the characters you come learn to behave. This is a small, pretty vague spoiler, but Lucas is dating Penelope, the captain of Scarlett's diving team at the beginning of the book. They break up pretty early on and before he gets with Scarlett. But him and Penelope agreed for some reason to not tell anybody else that they had like broken up for reasons. I tried to chalk it up to the fact that they were just like 20-year-olds, they're in college, they're not really making like the best decisions. And in hindsight, like, we can realize how much this doesn't really make sense. But it felt like one of those things that was like making conflict for the sense of just creating conflict in the book. That's all to why I say maybe. I think this book was a quick, easy, and I say easy in the sense of like I blew through it pretty easily in like a couple of days. I think honestly, if you're looking for a fun, quick beach read this summer, I would recommend Deep End. But do you need to push this to like the top of your list, or you need to read this like immediately? It's a maybe, yeah. Next, would I recommend Love of My Afterlife? No. Interesting concept, and I keep thinking that this would work honestly well as like an adaptation. I feel like I could see this being picked up by like Amazon Prime or Hulu, to be honest, but I feel like the book only really captured my attention in the last 70 pages of it, to be honest. I could get on my soapbox literally all day and talk about the ways in which I really hate, like, it seems I do, I hate it. It seems like more and more books in the adult contemporary romance genre are utilizing pop culture references as a hallmark for relatability and for humor, but I'm not, because you guys already know how I feel about that. But this is what this book felt like a symptom of. It petered off after the beginning, but the beginning sets the tone of the book, and so it did set the tone of the humor also, which subjectively was not funny to me. Like I said before, there were the bright spots of exploring community and not letting your life pass you by, and how life is hard, but what makes it beautiful at some points is how hard it is and how much you've invested emotionally. But there were also so many other elements of the story that felt flimsy, like the enemies to lovers aspect of who you realize is going to be the male love interest. And I feel like I didn't really note before, but there was a plot twist at the end of the book that made me really go like, oh, okay, I did not see that coming. Storytelling wise, that was one of the best parts of the book. But like I said, there were some bright spots, but the critiques and the things that made me go, outweighed it. Like, for example, the romance in the book is a enemies to lovers setup. And do I think that enemies to lovers can exist and work in the adult contemporary romance genre? Yes, I do. But I think that to the enemies bit, it can just feel so very, why do these characters hate each other? Why did this dislike turn into hate? Because that's the thing, when you frame it as like enemies to lovers, I take it as like these characters dislike each other for a very real reason. Sometimes I do think books would be better off framing it as dislike that turned into like awkwardness, or I think because the trope is so popular and it catches people's eyes, like enemies to lovers, ooh, there's not enough exploration of the ways in which tempering this trope to like different stages. Like, they don't need to hate each other. Even sometimes I can find it more endearing when it's like they weren't really aware of one another, or maybe they had an awkward encounter that just made it like awkward for them to interact, you know, elsewhere. And I do think like sometimes you have an encounter with somebody, you never have the right timing, and it turns into awkwardness, which turns into dislike, which eventually turns into hate. I can believe that, but sometimes it just feels like they're enemies for the sake of being enemies. Because that's the thing, if you're gonna make your characters enemies in a contemporary romance, there is the understanding that by the end of what is usually like a 350 page book, they're going to be lovers, and you need to convince me of that shift in likening. So no, I would not recommend. Then I read Kindred, which, yes, I would recommend. I said it before, this book leaned more into historical fiction than speculative fiction for me. I know there's, of course, the time travel element, but it was more of an element of the story that was like, at a certain point, this is going to keep happening and you kind of need to accept it. We're not here to explore the time travel of it all and like why this is happening. So I'd be interested to read more of Octavia Butler's work, like maybe like Fledgling or Parable of the Sower, to read kind of more of the getting into the nitty gritty or exploration of like why something dystopian is happening. But to Kindred, I enjoyed it for a couple of reasons. I enjoyed the prose. It was very quick and to the point while also leaving enough exploration and room to really sit with the ideas that it was presenting to you, especially in regards to, and this book was written in the 1970s. This is just a personal enjoyment of mine. When characters are thrown into crazy ass situations, when it's like fantasy, dystopian books, I try not to make myself like, when they make what feels like irrational decisions, because like I would also be behaving irrationally in a situation like that. And also it can feel true to the book more often than not in the character if they are like out of their wits. But what I appreciated about Dana is that she got right to work. Like each time she found herself back in that situation, she was not wasting any time. And I appreciated that because it felt like she was making adept and rational decisions that moved the plot along while also leaving enough room for, oh, we need to think about this more, explore this more. A part of me was trying to decide if this book left a little bit too much to the imagination, especially in regards to the time travel element and the ending, not to spoil, but I do think I've landed that it left you with just enough. And then I finished out the month with the final revival of Opal and Nev, which, yes, I would recommend. I enjoyed perspectively how this book was being told. It was told in interview clips that were detailing what happened in the past and also what was occurring in the present. And I like that each time we sat down with the character or when we looked back on that moment that character was being interviewed, we're getting a different truth from each character or their perceived idea of the truth. This also doesn't always work for me, but I appreciated the ways that the book was grounding itself into reality. It at times mentioned popular historical figures or popular musicians as a way to show that, oh, this duo did interact with these famous people as they were also famous people as if they existed in our world. It did feel a little clunky at times, but it did get across what the book was trying to get across, and I didn't necessarily hate it. This book is told in two parts, and I do think it lost some of its fervor and momentum in part two, especially leading up towards the ending. I think it wanted to end on a realistic note, but it's also an ending that a little bit made me go, that's it. But it definitely did have me hooked up until that point. And I think in reflection, while I didn't love the ending, I don't think it bothered me enough to take away from my enjoyment of the story. But I do think there are some elements of part two that could have been reworked. Not so much feel like a come down that the roller coaster that part one was. Now we're moving on to TV. Yes, I would recommend Adolescence on Netflix, and I do think everybody should watch it. I do think there's been a couple pieces of media in the past couple years that have tried to touch on the ways in which young boys are being indoctrinated into incel culture, but I feel like Adolescence not only touched on that, but the way in which the agglomeration of it touches all facets of society currently, young girls, families, the parents who take care of them. How I don't think anybody truly thinks it's benign or is not a problem that people are paying attention to, but truly the ways in which misogyny, incel culture, Andrew Tate culture can manifest in this violent and traumatic way. And I want to implore people to stop trying to turn this show into like a whodunit. I fear this is a symptom of everybody wanting to be a detective in the face of true crime, because at the heart of the show, it's not like what happened. We learned pretty quickly like what happened. It's more so why this happened. Next, yes, I would recommend Paradise on Hulu. It's interesting that I feel like marketing wise, like, you know, like an ad will usually pop up on TikTok or you'll see like a commercial on TV. I saw next to nothing about Paradise in consideration to that, but where I mostly got recommendations for this were people saying like you have to watch this like review wise, and I can see why. I did get minorly spoiled for honestly what turned out to be like a pretty big plot twist in the show, but that didn't take away from my enjoyment of it. Maybe because it feels a little real to what could happen in real life if a situation like this did actually happen in our world played out. But I did really enjoy the world building of it all and the way in which each episode up until like the latter half was a look and deep dive into who this character was before the world ended and after the world ended. What I enjoyed in particular too was the dialogue of the show. Maybe this was an acting choice, but I do feel like it was probably something that was maybe like a director's choice. This is something that Sterling K. Brown did a lot of in This Is Us, which I never finished because it was making me way too sad. But when there are moments of that a character is launching into what feels like a spiel or a soliloquy, they would say something or implement a mannerism that offset it and made it seem more natural, which just feels like honestly good acting. So maybe I shouldn't be harping on it so much. But I remember in particular where the villain character was giving kind of this, it felt very villainous, a villainous Bond speech. It felt very in character, but it felt kind of corny and very much like, oh, okay, this is the villain giving her like villain speech. But then she kind of talks to that like, oh damn, I sound like a Bond villain character. And it kind of offsets what could be more unnatural dialogue in dystopian shows like this. For Daily Dose of Sunshine, I'm going to say maybe leaning towards the yes side. And I say maybe namely because the romance in the show was so unconvincing to me. I didn't really believe the female main character and who is obviously going to be her love interest. There was just really no chemistry at all to me, and I feel like towards the end of the show in particular, it becomes like more of a focal point. I say yes in terms of honest and transparent depictions of mental health. In particular, a character who suffers a breakdown after studying continuously for a test that he has not been able to pass. He was the standout actor to me. Like, he was very good. And the female lead's acting in this never disappoints for me. Anything I've seen her in, I've largely enjoyed her acting. But I feel like once the show started focusing more on the romantic elements of their relationship, I understood the angle that the show was trying to approach it from. But just because, honestly, I just didn't believe the actors had a lot of romantic chemistry. And I think it became even more obvious to me because there is like a second lead couple in the show who I believe had a lot of great chemistry and their scenes were really compelling to watch. So it was hard not to compare. So that's why I say maybe leaning towards yes, because I do think the show, not that it necessarily didn't need a romantic element, but I do think it suffered for it. But most of the show is an observation and look at the ways in which mental health and the awareness of it is stigmatized. And so, yes, I would recommend watching it for that, but landing on a maybe because some of the other reasons I mentioned. When Life Gives You Tangerines, yes, I would recommend this. IU acted her ass off in this drama, to be quite frank, which I haven't really seen her in a K-drama. She's been in them, but I haven't really seen her in a K-drama since My Mister, which her acting impressed me in that, but I feel like there wasn't much room for, it did feel at times like there was a bit of stagnancy to it, and I know that she was in Hotel de Luna, but I never watched that. But when it came to the emotion in her acting, especially the nuances in her acting, I think it was very well done. I say nuances as crying because you're sad versus crying because you're agitated versus crying because you're annoyed. I do feel like I could actually feel like the differences actually did come across really well when she was acting. I'm going to be frank, I didn't realize that Park Bo-gum was doing his military service, which makes sense now because I haven't really watched a K-drama, and outside of the two that I'm mentioning now, I haven't really watched a K-drama in a long time, to be honest. And so I didn't even realize that he was kind of out of the loop in those things. But the K-dramas that he did before his leave, they were not they were not great, guys. The one that he most recently did before this one, where he was in an age gap relationship, I didn't watch much of it, namely because this wasn't only to him, but the writing and storytelling across the board didn't really look great, and neither did the acting, unfortunately. But Record of Youth, again, not only him, I think that drama was painful across the board, to be so for real, but there was just something so stilted about it, which was odd because the earlier work that I'd seen him in, where one, he plays, I believe, a serial killer. It's the drama where Dio from EXO also plays a serial killer. And Is It My Love in the Moonlight? Superb acting on both ends. So I was honestly really confused. But this was a reminder to me that like, oh yeah, like he has acting chops. And the actors who play their aged up selves also do a wonderful job. I feel like there were so many people I saw saying that they preferred the story when the characters were younger, which of course is a preference that people can have, but it felt namely like, oh, IU and Park Bo-gum were like really attractive and I don't want to like watch the story anymore because of that. But the older characters also bring so much heart to the story. Like, that's the whole idea of it. If you like K-dramas like the Reply series or Dear My Friends, which is one of my favorite K-dramas, and I don't say this often, but I do feel like it's really underrated, and looks at generational trauma, the relationships between parents and their children, the relationship in particular between mothers and their daughters, this is a show that I definitely would recommend. I also think I was maybe surprised how much I enjoyed this, namely because the K-dramas produced by Netflix have largely kind of left me feeling, and I say not all of them. I know a lot of people think that the K-drama run-on is boring, and I can see why they think that, but it was one of my faves from when I watched it. But there's just been something about the storytelling when it comes to K-dramas produced by Netflix that feel very empty. Like, the writing is kind of lackluster. The acting, honestly, from casting will be pretty superb, but then the writing is just not great. But that is not a problem that When Life Gives You Tangerines had. I feel like across the board, it really checked all of its boxes. And this is something I've been thinking about both to books and media, where sometimes I do feel like shows can be gratuitous and making it feel like they're trying to make you cry, if that makes sense. Like, it's not necessarily emotional, they're just trying to make you cry. But I feel like the show didn't fall into that trap. It was an exploration of a mother's journey, a hard look at the ways in which poverty can traumatize, and that in itself was emotional. It didn't feel like the show was banging you over the head trying to make you cry constantly. Sometimes I do feel that way about shows, and it can feel like it's playing on your emotions because something sad is happening, so of course you're going to cry, but it didn't feel like the show fed into that. If you can't tell, I just finished it and I am sad that we don't have any more Fridays where it's going to be coming on. But yeah, those are my thoughts. Let me know what you read and watched in March. I'm curious. What did you like? What did you hate? Let me know. I want to discuss. Bye guys.